My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I'm about to tell you. Secrets that have burned inside me for 23 years. Secrets that could still get me killed even today. For decades, the world believed they knew who controlled Japan's most powerful Yakuza organization. They saw the public face, the ceremonial meetings, the ritual tattoos displayed at carefully orchestrated events. They thought they understood our hierarchy. They understood nothing. I spent 15 years as what the media called a high-ranking boss in the Yamaguchi-gumi. Newspapers wrote about my supposed power, my influence over territories stretching from Kobe to Tokyo. Police files described me as a decision-maker, someone who commanded fear and respect across the criminal underworld. But every morning when I looked in the mirror, I saw the truth they couldn't see. I was nothing more than an expensive marionette, dancing to strings pulled by hands that never showed themselves in public. The realization came during a winter meeting in 2001, in a traditional ryokan hidden in the mountains of Hakone. I had been summoned, though they called it an invitation, along with 7 other supposed leaders. We sat on tatami mats in a room that smelled of incense and old wood, discussing what we believed was a territorial dispute in Osaka. The conversation flowed exactly as these meetings always did. Formal, respectful, following protocols that had been established for generations. But something felt different that night. Maybe it was the way our host, an elderly man I'd never seen before, observed us without speaking. His presence commanded the room despite his silence. Or maybe it was how our most heated debates seemed to resolve themselves in ways that none of us had actually proposed, as if our words were being guided by an invisible current. It was during a break, when I stepped outside for air, that I overheard a phone conversation that changed everything. 2 men I didn't recognize were speaking in low tones near the garden. Their words were careful, coded, but I caught enough to understand. Every decision we had made that evening had already been decided. Every territory we thought we were negotiating had already been allocated. We weren't leaders debating strategy. We were actors performing a script written by someone else. The next morning, I began watching more carefully. I noticed patterns that had always been there but that I had dismissed as coincidence. How certain proposals always emerged at the exact right moment, how potential conflicts resolved themselves before they could escalate, how information flowed through our organization in ways that bypassed the official hierarchy entirely. I started to see the puppet strings, and once you see them, you can never unsee them again. The deeper I looked, the more I realized that our entire public structure was theater designed to protect something far more sophisticated. While outsiders focused on traditional Yakuza hierarchies, the oyabun, the kobun, the elaborate tattoos and severed fingers, the real power operated through what I came to call the network. These weren't the men whose photos appeared in police databases or whose names made headlines when crackdowns occurred. The network consisted of individuals who held no official titles within our organization, who attended no ceremonies, who bore no identifying marks of membership. They were businessmen, retired bureaucrats, university professors, even some who worked within law enforcement itself. Their connection to our world was invisible, documented nowhere, acknowledged by no one. I discovered their existence by accident in 2003, during what should have been a routine meeting about smuggling operations through Yokohama port. I had arrived early and was waiting in an adjacent room when I witnessed something impossible. Our most feared Kumicho, a man whose reputation for violence was legendary, receiving detailed instructions from someone who looked like an ordinary salaryman. The Kumicho listened with the deference of a student, taking notes, asking for clarification on points of strategy that involved millions of yen and hundreds of lives. That ordinary-looking man wasn't just giving advice, he was issuing orders, and our supposedly all-powerful leader was following them without question. Over the following months, I began identifying members of this shadow network. They communicated through channels that bypassed our entire organization. They met in places that had no connection to Yakuza territory, quiet coffee shops in Ginza, private dining rooms in hotels that catered to legitimate businessmen, even academic conferences where they hid in plain sight among scholars and intellectuals. The brilliance of their system became clear to me gradually. By maintaining this separation, they could operate with complete deniability. When police investigations targeted our organization, they found Exactly what they expected to find. Traditional Yakuza structure, obvious hierarchies, predictable criminal activities. The real architects of our operations remained completely invisible, protected by layers of intermediaries who often didn't even know they were serving the network's interests. But the most unsettling discovery came when I realized that some members of the network weren't just advising our operations, they were coordinating them with activities that went far beyond traditional, organized crime. They were influencing political appointments, manipulating stock prices, directing the flow of international investments. Our Yakuza activities were just one component of a much larger machine, a machine that touched every aspect of Japanese society in ways that would have shocked even us if we had understood the full scope. I began keeping detailed records, photographing meetings when possible, documenting patterns of communication and decision-making. I told myself I was gathering intelligence that might prove useful someday, but the truth was simpler and more frightening. I was trying to understand how deep my own imprisonment went. By 2005, my investigation had revealed something that terrified me more than any Yakuza conflict I had ever witnessed. The network wasn't unified. There were factions within it, competing groups with different visions for how Japan should be shaped, different ideas about which international partnerships to pursue, different opinions about how much traditional Yakuza culture should be preserved versus modernized. And we, the visible Yakuza, the men whose names appeared in newspapers and whose faces were known to police, we were the soldiers in a war we didn't even know was being fought. The first major battle I witnessed played out through what appeared to be a standard territorial dispute between our organization and a rival clan in Kyushu. From our perspective, it was about control of pachinko parlors and construction contracts. We followed the usual patterns: negotiations, shows of force, carefully managed violence that would send messages without attracting too much police attention. But I had learned to watch for the invisible hands guiding these events, and what I saw chilled me. The conflict wasn't really about territory at all. It was about which faction within the network would control a particular channel for moving money and influence between Japan and Southeast Asia. The rival clan wasn't our enemy. They were puppets for a different set of string pullers, and the real battle was happening in boardrooms and private clubs that neither side of Yakuza ever saw. The war escalated through proxies. Legitimate businesses that we had never heard of suddenly became crucial to our operations. Investment patterns shifted in ways that affected our revenue streams. Political connections that we had relied on for decades mysteriously dried up, while new opportunities emerged from unexpected directions. Most disturbing of all, I began to suspect that some of the violence, including deaths of men I had known and respected, was being orchestrated not to resolve Yakuza disputes, but to eliminate individuals who had learned too much about the network's operations. Men who asked too many questions. Men who, like me, had begun to see the puppet strings. I realized I was in extraordinary danger, not from rival Yakuza or from police investigation, but from the very system that I had served. Without understanding. The network had allowed me to discover them because they were evaluating whether I could be useful to their purposes or whether I represented a threat that needed to be eliminated. The moment of truth came during a meeting in late 2005 in a private room above a traditional restaurant in Asakusa. I was summoned by a man I had never met, someone who claimed to represent mutual interests. He was soft-spoken, dressed in an expensive but unremarkable suit, the kind of person who could disappear into any crowd in Tokyo. He knew everything, not just about my investigation, but about my family, my financial arrangements, my personal fears and ambitions. He spoke as if he were reviewing a detailed dossier, which I suppose he was. And then he made me an offer that wasn't really an offer at all. I could continue serving the organization exactly as I always had, with the added responsibility of providing them with intelligence about which of my colleagues might be, developing inconvenient curiosities about our true structure. Or I could disappear, not just from the Yakuza, but from Japan entirely, with enough money to start over anywhere in the world, but with the understanding that if I ever spoke about what I had learned, the reach of the network would find me no matter where I went. I had 48 hours to decide. I chose exile, but not immediately. First, I needed to understand one final piece of the puzzle. How deep did the network's influence actually go? And how long had they been operating this way? Using connections that I had developed over years of investigation, I traced patterns backwards through decades of Yakuza history. What I found was staggering. The network hadn't emerged recently. They had been shaping Japanese organized crime since at least the 1960s, possibly longer. Every major shift in Yakuza operations, every significant conflict between organizations, every evolution in how we related to law enforcement and legitimate business, all of it had been guided by this invisible hand. The traditional Yakuza culture that we thought we were preserving, the codes of honor and loyalty that defined our identity, even the specific ways that we structured our hierarchies, these weren't ancient traditions passed down unchanged through generations. They were carefully maintained theater, designed to provide cover for operations that were far more sophisticated and internationally connected than any of us had imagined. More disturbing still, I realized that the network's influence extended far beyond Japan. They were coordinating with similar shadow structures in other countries, managing flows of money, drugs, weapons, and people across international borders in ways that made traditional law enforcement approaches completely ineffective. What looked like Japanese organized crime was actually one component of a global system that operated above and around the legal frameworks of individual nations. On my final night in Japan, I visited the grave of my mentor, an old Kamicho who had recruited me into the organization 30 years earlier. He had died believing he was a warrior in an ancient tradition, a man who lived and died by codes of loyalty and honor that connected him to centuries of Yakuza history. Standing in that cemetery, I felt the full weight of my knowledge. He had been as much a puppet as any of us, playing a role in someone else's design, never understanding that his courage and sacrifice served purposes he could never have imagined. I left Japan in January 2006 with a new identity and enough money to disappear completely. For 17 years I have remained silent, building a quiet life in a place I cannot name, always watching for signs that the network has decided I know too much to be allowed to live. But age and isolation have made me reckless, or perhaps simply tired of carrying these secrets alone. The world continues to believe it understands how organized crime operates, continues to focus on the visible figures, while the real architects of power remain completely hidden. Law enforcement celebrates arrests of high-profile Yakuza leaders, never realizing they are capturing middle management, while the true controllers remain untouchable. This confession is my final act of rebellion against the system that used me for decades without my knowledge. I am old now, and if the network decides that my death is necessary to protect their secrets, so be it. But these truths deserve to be spoken at least once, even if the world isn't ready to believe them. The Yakuza you think you know, the tattooed men with severed fingers, the elaborate ceremonies and traditional codes, they are real, but they are also a magnificent deception. Behind them operates a machine of power and influence that shapes not just Japanese crime, but Japanese society itself, in ways that reach into every aspect of political and economic life. And if such a network exists in Japan, hidden in plain sight for generations, what similar structures might exist in your own country, pulling strings you cannot see, making decisions that affect your life in ways you will never understand? Some secrets are too dangerous to keep, and too dangerous to tell. I have chosen to tell them anyway because the alternative, letting this system continue to operate in perfect invisibility, is worse than whatever consequences may come for me. The puppet show continues, but now you know to look for the strings. 3 months after leaving Japan, I thought I had successfully disappeared. I was living in a small coastal town, keeping a low profile, learning to sleep without the constant anxiety that had plagued my final years in Tokyo. I should have known better. The network's reach was longer than even I had imagined. It started with small things, too small for anyone else to notice, but when you've spent years watching for invisible patterns, you develop instincts for when something isn't right. A new customer at the local internet cafe who always seemed to be there when I was. The same rental car parked on different streets near my apartment, always with different license plates, but the same small scratch on the rear bumper. Phone calls that disconnected the moment I answered. The first direct message came through a method that chilled me to the bone, a traditional Japanese funeral arrangement delivered to my door, with a card that contained only my real name, the name I Thought no one in this country knew. No threat, no demand, just acknowledgement that they had found me. I moved immediately, but within 2 weeks, another arrangement arrived at my new address. This time, the flowers included chrysanthemums arranged in a pattern that I recognized from network communications, a specific configuration that meant, "Your time is limited." For 6 months, I lived like a ghost, constantly moving, using cash for everything, avoiding any technology that could be traced. But gradually I began to understand that this wasn't just a hunt, it was a test. They weren't trying to kill me immediately. They were demonstrating their capabilities, showing me that nowhere was beyond their reach. No identity too carefully constructed to penetrate. The breakthrough came when I realized they were using my own investigation against me. Every contact I had developed while researching the network, every source who had provided me with information, was now feeding them intelligence about my movements and activities. The very network of informants that had revealed their secrets was now their tool for tracking me. But understanding their method also revealed their weakness. They were relying on human intelligence, which meant their information was only as current as their last contact. If I could break the pattern, disappear completely from anyone who had known me during my investigation years, I might be able to create genuine invisibility. The problem was that such a disappearance would require help, and anyone capable of providing that level of assistance would demand to know why I needed it, which meant revealing at least part of what I knew about the network, exactly the kind of exposure that had put me in danger in the first place. I spent weeks evaluating options before settling on an approach that was risky but potentially effective. I would make contact with someone who had their own reasons for opposing the network's activities, someone who might see my knowledge as valuable enough to protect rather than eliminate. The person I chose was a former police detective who had been investigating Yakuza connections to political corruption before his career was mysteriously derailed. His name was Takeshi Yamamoto, and according to my research, he had come dangerously close to exposing network operations before being transferred to a meaningless desk job and eventually forced into early retirement. Finding him was easy. He was living quietly in Sapporo, working as a private security consultant. Convincing him to meet was harder, but eventually the promise of information about why his investigation had been shut down was too tempting to refuse. We met in a crowded shopping mall, surrounded by enough people and noise to make electronic surveillance difficult. I had planned to reveal only enough to secure his cooperation, but when I saw the hunger in his eyes, the desperate need of a man who had spent years knowing he was close to something important without being able to prove it, I made a decision that changed everything. I told him about the network. Not everything, but enough. Enough about their structure, their methods, their influence over both Yakuza operations and legitimate institutions. Enough to make him understand that his investigation hadn't failed because of bureaucratic politics or bad luck. It had been systematically dismantled by people with more power and better connections than he had ever imagined. His response was immediate and practical. If they're hunting you and you know this much about them, then you're either an incredibly valuable asset or an unacceptable threat. Either way, we need to document everything you know before they succeed in silencing you. That conversation was the beginning of the most dangerous partnership of my life. Yamamoto proved to be as methodical in exile as he had been as a detective. Over the course of 3 months, working from a series of safe houses that he arranged through contacts in legitimate law enforcement, we documented everything I knew about the network: names, meeting locations, operational patterns, financial structures, all of it organized into a comprehensive dossier that revealed the full scope of their influence. But as we worked together, Yamamoto's investigation skills uncovered connections that even I hadn't seen. Using public records, financial documents, and his knowledge of how legitimate institutions actually operated, he was able to trace the network's influence through layers of society that I had never imagined they could penetrate. The most shocking discovery came when we were analyzing patterns of political appointments over the past 2 decades. Yamamoto noticed that certain key positions in regulatory agencies, in the prosecutor's office, in international trade organizations, had been filled by individuals who all had subtle connections to businesses that I had identified as network fronts. This isn't just Organized crime with political connections, he told me during one of our late-night working sessions. This is systematic capture of governmental functions. They're not just influencing policy, they're making policy. The implications were staggering. Every anti-organized crime initiative, every international cooperation agreement, every regulatory change that affected how money flowed between countries, all of it had been shaped by people who were secretly serving network interests. Law enforcement agencies were fighting a war against organized crime, using strategies that had been designed by organized crime itself. But the most terrifying revelation came when Yamamoto used his law enforcement contacts to run background checks on some of the network members I had identified. Several of them had connections to similar organizations in other countries, not just business relationships, but operational partnerships that suggested a level of international coordination that made traditional concepts of national sovereignty almost meaningless. They're not Japanese, Yamamoto said, staring at the evidence spread across our table. I mean, some of them are, but the network itself, it's not a Japanese organization that has international connections. It's an international organization that has a Japanese branch. That understanding changed everything about my situation. I wasn't being hunted by Yakuza seeking revenge, or even by a powerful Japanese criminal organization, trying to protect its secrets. I was being pursued by a global system that had resources and reach that no national government could effectively challenge. The decision to go public came after we discovered evidence that the network was planning a major operation that would affect millions of people across multiple countries. The details were complex, involving currency manipulation, infrastructure investments, and political changes that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in East Asia. But the basic pattern was familiar: create chaos in legitimate systems, then provide solutions that increased network control over the resulting restructured institutions. We have enough evidence to expose them, Yamamoto said. But if we do this, there's no going back. For either of us. I had spent 17 years running from this moment, but I realized that running was just another form of serving their interests. As long as I remained silent, terrified, focused only on my own survival, the network could continue operating with complete impunity. My knowledge was only valuable if I was willing to use it. We prepared multiple copies of our documentation, distributing them through different channels to journalists, law enforcement agencies, and academic researchers in several countries. We included instructions for verification, contact information for additional sources, and enough detail to allow independent investigation of our claims. The response was swift and devastating. Within 48 hours of our first release, Yamamoto was dead, an apparent heart attack that fooled no one who knew him. His final message to me was simple: they move faster than we expected. The documentation is out there now. Make sure it stays out there. I am writing these final words from a location that will remain hidden, knowing that this confession will likely be my last act. The network has demonstrated that they can reach anyone, anywhere, whenever they choose. But they have also demonstrated something else. They are not invincible. They can be exposed, understood, and ultimately challenged. The evidence that Yamamoto and I compiled is now in the hands of people who understand its significance and who have the resources to act on it. Whether they will have the courage to do so remains to be seen, but for the first time in decades, the network faces the possibility of genuine exposure, of having their invisible operations dragged into public scrutiny. This confession serves as both warning and invitation. Warning to those who believe they understand how power really operates in our modern world. The reality is far more complex and far more disturbing than most people imagine. And invitation to those who have the ability to investigate further, to follow the threads that Yamamoto and I have identified, to continue the work that cost him his life and will likely cost me mine. The puppet show continues, but the curtain has been pulled back just far enough for those who are willing to look. What they choose to do with that glimpse behind the stage will determine whether this system continues to operate in perfect invisibility or whether humanity finally begins to understand who is really pulling the strings. My part in this story ends here, but the story itself, the story of hidden networks, invisible power, and the price of truth, that story is just beginning.